wrist issues are more than just something which plagues a particular player, but then translates into a weaker team as a whole. Now, of course, that seems pretty obvious from the outset, right? Like one player is playing poorly, so that means that the rest of the team then, as a result, take a hit as well too. But when you look at some of these actual players and what's been going on with them when they state that they have a wrist injury, then you start to see that it actually is more than it appears from the surface of just this individual player playing bad, but it actually scales into maybe champion picks. It scales into solo queue. It scales into all these different aspects of what this player is in control of, and to where it's at a greater magnitude of effectiveness or I guess a detriment to the team than you would initially first think. And so the first player that I want to discuss is Jensen, because going from Cloud9 over to Team Liquid, his champion pool has been incredibly limited, and we can even see this in the most recent Worlds for 2019. It's obvious that his champion pool is pretty shallow. He couldn't play Qiyana, which is another reason of why Team Liquid had to ban Qiyana for all of groups, and then when they let it through against IG, he got solo killed by Rookie, seemingly not knowing what Qiyana's range is, or burst, or even the rotation of her kit. So it just seemed like he had no clue exactly what the champion did, and this is possibly stemming from the idea that he doesn't get a lot of solo queue time, which is primarily where you would learn about a new champion, right? Whenever a new patch drops, everyone knows that you need to go and grind solo queue. Even plebs know that, okay, cool, when I get into solo queue, either I need to ban this champion because I don't know what the fuck they do, which is generally the amateur approach to handling a pick, is just like, all right, I don't know what it does, I don't want to have to face it or learn about it. But that's not the case with pro players, right? They need to learn about these new picks. So in solo queue, that's a perfect environment to do that. Grind against it and try and do different matchups against it. And that's what also the person playing this new champion wants to learn as well too. They want you to play different things and see what kind of counters it and what doesn't. So this is the environment, and actually in which solo queue is very valuable for players. And then so Jensen had this gap, and has had this gap in his champion pool. I mean, you could even go back to when Silas was OP, TL were still banning it, right? He had, I think, a couple games on it, maybe 3 or 4 games or something. But when it was like really OP, TL were just like, now we can't really deal with this. We don't know how to deal with it. Let's just kind of push it to the wind instead. When, in fact, it's actually an incredible flex pick, as we learned later and later when he became more and more meta and more OP. And so it was a really big detriment to Team Liquid back in the summer split when, he was pretty good early on. So it just seems like the wrist issues, when Jensen had cited this, that was when it began to show that, okay, well, since he's slowing down on solo queue, and also in scrims too, because you have to remember that Team Liquid also stated that they were practicing with their sub mid laner. So it becomes this not only detriment of solo queue, where he's not practicing a whole lot, but also scrims, where he's practicing like 50%. And when you're practicing 50% in scrims, usually you're probably not going to experiment a whole lot, right? You aren't going to try vastly new different compositions or different game plans on who you want to play to what particular lane and whatnot. So it becomes this really limiting factor for Team Liquid in how they want to change their entire playstyle, because if you do, then you're going to need a lot of practice in terms of how you want to shape the team, around your new game plan. So with a guy playing 50% of scrims, that becomes incredibly difficult, right? Licorice, same thing. Hasn't played the same since spring of 2019, right? And then he was subbed out in summer split for Kumo. So this was at a moment to where his performance had considerably declined. And I even interviewed Licorice about this, and I was talking about, well, okay, it doesn't seem like you're this dominating force now, right? I didn't put it as like incredibly harsh, like, oh, you're shit, like, guess what, you were really fucking good back then, why are you shit now? No, I didn't say that. But I did say that in essence, he was incredibly good, and he was quite inarguably the best top laner previously. And then now, he's been knocked down a couple pegs. So, like, has the wrist injury affected this? And it seems as though it has, right? It seems as though this isn't the same Licorice that we've seen previously. And now a lot of people might contribute that to, say, Cloud9's decision to not put as many draft resources or to play to his lane as frequently. But I would also say that he hasn't justified that either, right? He has had a considerable slip in performance. So, like, what does that justify you actually playing towards his lane anyways? I think the performance declined before the priority of putting him as preference for both resources and draft resources, in game and then draft phase, has actually come after his performance slipping. So as we can see, this was after he had stated, that he had wrist issues, and it becomes very apparent that has affected his effectiveness in Cloud9. Now, when you go over, a little bit further back, we're going to when High, of course, famously, when he was trailing off, and we all know the story of how he had wrist issues, and he had stated that, and this was already when he was kind of declining, and people noticed that he was declining, and then he stated, yeah, I have wrist issues. And so this was just a massive hole that Cloud9 had to plug up in the mid lane, right? And so he became this big liability. And then also his champion pool was incredibly lacking. He didn't have any meta champions that he was playing. And once again, this is a byproduct of a player having wrist issues. So that means that he's going to take it easy in solo queue, which then also means that he's not going to be doing primarily what solo queue's function is for a pro player, which is learning new matchups or the new meta, or maybe new builds come out or new items come out, and so that reconfigures what champions are stronger and which champions are weaker. Or also too, of course, just as is obvious, a new champion comes out, and then if you can't play him or you don't know all the matchups, then you're kind of fucked, right? So this was kind of High's burden, and I think this was his part of his downfall in essence, and his shot calling skills just eventually couldn't make up for that, right? His laning skills were subpar, and the team knew this entirely, and especially enemy teams knew this entirely. So they would actually target him out when it came to maybe the ban phase or even just a jungle pressure type setup. And so when that happens, when a player is on the downtrend and you know it, and maybe they have an injury, this is information for another team. And that's where it gets kind of fucked up, to be honest. But I mean, if you're going to use an advantage, right? A player is somewhat injured. Yeah, use that. It's all is fair in love and war, right? So now you go to a little bit further back. Freeze. Now, Freeze was a good example in H2K and how he just got completely sidelined when he stopped playing because of wrist issues, right? And so he took a break, and that was when Forgiven took over his position, right? And so Freeze eventually just didn't appear in the LEC or EU LCS back in the day anymore, and then he went to minor regions instead. And yeah, he was actually pretty good over in Turkey, of course, and maybe you can compare that to the level of Turkey ADCs and whatnot, or Turkish ADCs and whatnot. But at this time, it was just this guy clearly had showed that, okay, he has this weakness, and do teams want to actually take the chance to where this player might not be able to practice as much, right? This is the reality of the situation that you have to look at, even if this is a shitty situation for the player themselves too, right? And so Finally, you get to probably one of my last examples, which is Laud, right? Laud or Benji, as he's known as right now. This is one of the prime examples to where he got replaced in Summer Split of 2017 by Altec. And this was when he was going through like massive wrist issues. I mean, he was quite vocal about this, in fact. And so you had this time to where he released a big twit longer about it, and he had slowed down in practicing solo queue, and then he basically decided to ignore his wrist issues, and that was when he started to see an uptick in his performance, but then his wrist issues just came back even stronger. And so this is like this predicament to where it's, as JJ had put it in an interview, which I'll link in the description below from the Shot Caller, which was that it's kind of taboo to talk about your wrist issues because then you're somewhat damaged goods, right? Then you're a risk or a liability for a team. And it's actually a great point. Yeah, this is true because JJ was replaced by Wadid, right? Like JJ started to perform badly, and then he was replaced by Wadid, and Wadid, didn't perform phenomenally. But fact of the matter is that FlyQuest actually thought that Wadid was the better choice because JJ was slipping in performance, and probably because he was having wrist issues as well. So what I'm saying at the end of the day is that solo queue is said to be worthless to pros in NA, right? But the one good thing about that is that it's used as an experimental grounds, and when you have wrist issues, as some of these players that I've mentioned have had, then you start to slow your practice of what solo queue is primarily for, which is experimentation, right? So when a new champion's released, when new items are released. And so it becomes a burden then on your team because they have to adapt the entire draft, which is incredibly important more and more now, even more so as flex picks have become, quite meta, to where if you can't play a couple of these flex picks, you're fucked. Like, you really screw your team over, because even if your top laner can play the flex pick, well, if everyone knows that, Aatrox is always going to go top, well, you're kind of screwed, right? So it becomes this really big detriment both to your coach. Now your coach is going to kind of look like shit, right? If plebs don't understand the fact of the matter that maybe this player can't play a specific champion, but it looks like the coach had thrown the draft because he's not putting this specific champion over and in mid lane or something, or in jungle, right? So it's difficult to grind in solo queue when you have these wrist issues, and then of course you have on top of that scrim obligations, and some players are doing 50% of scrims. So teams know essentially that your player is hurt, especially when he comes out and says it in interviews. And I'm not saying that this shouldn't be said necessarily, but it's a harsh reality that many in the scene should consider when discussing to the public about if your player is having wrist issues. Maybe you just do it privately. Maybe you say, hey, I'm having wrist issues. Can I be subbed out, for a particular amount of time? Now, the big issue with this is maybe, okay, well, then that means that it looks like this player is getting subbed out for performance aspects. But then, well, behind the scenes, you could always just tell, teams or other teams, especially within free agency, that, hey, by the way, this player was subbed out because of wrist issues. So don't put that against him when, he was being subbed out, essentially. And so you have this predicament to where, okay, you still maintain your competitiveness during the season, and hopefully you get through that without anyone realizing that your player has wrist issues, and so therefore they don't try and take advantage of that particular player within the draft, or maybe within the entire team dynamic of trying to focus mid lane or focus top lane or jungle or whatever, right? So at the end of the day, wrist issues are a big problem, but it becomes more than just the player themselves, and it becomes a team-wide issue. And for teams to actually try and be burdened by that is a really difficult ask, and that's why you saw TSM sub out Grig for Acadian and use Acadian for a particularly long amount of time, although of course they fucking didn't go with both of them, but that's a TSM problem more than anything. So at the end of the day, yeah, wrist issues suck, but it's the fact of the matter is that stating that your player has wrist issues is an advantage that other teams can take and then can use against you. So I would advise teams to actually consider whether the benefit of saying that a player has wrist issues outweighs actually just hiding it instead and doing otherwise in order to protect your competitiveness, because this is kind of the dichotomy of, yeah, maybe you might have fans hate you for a specific reason or whatnot that they aren't privy to, but in the other hand, it might actually protect your chances in order to make playoffs or semis or what have you. So it's a really delicate situation, and there are some really shitty situations within wrist issues and how that's plagued a lot of these League of Legends players' careers and whatnot, and especially with team organizations holding that against them. But at the end of the day, you have to decide whether you want to protect your competitiveness or you want to actually just have the public know just for the benefit of knowing. So it becomes this dilemma, and I don't think that there's necessarily one particular solution that is always 100% right, but I would actually side with keeping it on the low so that people don't dissect your draft or don't dissect your team problems and then attack that itself.